todos, mi nombre es Rafael Echevarne, soy el director general de ACI América Latina y Caribe, con base en Panamá, y es un honor tener a los invitados de excepción que nos van a hablar de temas que no son muy comunes en esta parte del mundo, en América Latina y el Caribe, pero que están teniendo un gran impacto en otras partes del mundo. Vamos a hablar de dos temas: la liberalización de los servicios de navegación aérea, por un lado, y después los servicios de torre remotos. Voy a cambiar al inglés para dar la bienvenida a nuestros speakers. Hello, good morning, gentlemen. I just said hello to our participants in Spanish. So thank you very much, Mr. Håkan Olsson, Managing Director of Ninox, and Mr. Torbjørn Henriksen, who is the RT Operational Solutions Manager at Avinor, the Norwegian air navigation service provider. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for agreeing to join in on a very, very interesting topic. Well, two interesting topics. On the one hand, the liberalization of air navigation services, and of course, the other one is the provision of remote tower services from remote locations. Years ago, in 1987, the British government actually decided to privatize the British Airports Authority, or BAA, which actually set in motion the privatization of airports around the world, or if not the privatization, the provision of airport services by private companies. A similar sort of revolution actually started in the 1990s in Europe with the partial privatization of NATS, the provider of navigation services in the United Kingdom, and of course in Germany with DFS. So that actually has set the wheels in motion, but probably in a slower fashion than the airports. As I was explaining to you, Latin America this situation has not really taken off. So this is a very, very timely time to discuss these very important issues. So we will start with Mr. Olsson, Håkan Olsson, who's going to be talking about the liberalization of air navigation providers. And then the next presentation will be by Torbjørn on remote tower provision. And we will have questions at the end of these two presentations. So without further ado, thank you very much. So Håkan, the presentation is yours. And I will let Francisco say a few words before in regards to the questions.
Yes, thank you, Rafael. Good morning to all the participants and the speakers. In order to deliver the questions for the panelists, please send your questions to this email address, info@aci-lac.aero. And at the end of the two sessions, we will share your questions to both panelists. This will be done at the end of the two presentations. Without further ado, we will pass to Håkan and with his presentation of liberalization on air navigation service providers.
Thank you, Francisco. Buenos dias, bom dia. My name is Håkan Olsson. Unfortunately, my Spanish is not good enough, so I have to do the presentation in English. But you shall receive the presentations in both English and also translated to Spanish, so I hope that helps a bit. I'm the Managing Director of Ninox Air Navigation Services, an ANSP operating in Spain. I have two jobs. I'm originally from Avinor, where I'm Director of Business Development, so I share my time between Norway and Spain. At the moment, though, I'm stuck in Norway because of the corona situation we have over here as well. So, liberalization or deregulation, as we call it in Europe, is interesting, I think. So, next slide, please. Just want to start a little bit of background of Avinor and Ninox, where we're coming from. Avinor Air Navigation Services is a daughter company to Avinor in Norway, who operates the airports. Avinor ANS, we are the ANSP of Norway, stately owned, around 1,000 employees, and we operate more than 50 airports. Go to the next slide, please. Four main areas we operate in. The classic towers, which if we go from the text from the left to the right here. The classic towers, both ATC controlled towers and also AFIS towers. And then we have recently started building up our remote tower centers, and we are gradually now moving more and more airports over to remote center. My colleague Torbjörn will go into more detail there. The first airport went into operation last year, and by the end of this year we should have 4 in total there. And at the end of 2022 we will operate 15 airports from one location in northern Norway. Technology services, that's our engineers. They keep the CNS services going. And last we have the en route services, which is the operating 3 en route service centers, or ACCs, in Norway, 1 in the north, 1 in the west, and 1 in the south. Next slide, please. And here you can see all the airports in Norway. Norway is a small country, but only 5 million people living here. But due to the climate and geography, we need a lot of airports to sort of keep the country together. It's very difficult to travel around, and especially in the northern part of Norway, because of weather conditions, geography, and so on. So therefore, we have learned how to operate a lot of small airports at the same time, which also makes a good case for remote towers, which we are building out. Next slide. In line with the developments in Europe, we have also at Avinor ANS start looking at other countries where we could operate as an ANSP, and we together with a Spanish partner, Gesnair. This company is called Ninox Air Navigation Services, and we will offer all the traditional services, and ASP will operate in Spain, and we will also look outside Spain eventually when we get further down the line. Next slide. We think that Avinor and Gesnair together is a good partnership, since Avinor we provide the ANSP services, and Gesnair is more the experts in airport operations and so on. So us together is a good service provider in Spain and abroad, we believe. Next one. There, as was introduced by Raphael, the ANS competition in Europe started in the what has been talked about for a long time, since the both 80s and 90s, but it has been a bit slow. It's not until the last decade was things started to happen. And the main driver for this ANS competition is, of course, cost. Eurocontrol, governments and so on, they have seen that there might be ways to do the ANS more cost-effective than what traditionally have been done in Europe. Traditionally, here has been one ANSP per country, and this has been a monopoly and is owned by the government. At the same time, there's always been an objective that it should not allow to lower the standards for safety, security, and service in general, and so on. So not all countries have moved ahead yet, but more and more are now starting to look at it. And if you see at the next slide, we can see the main airports that has been privatized so far. It started in Germany in 2007 with 10 regional airports in the south, which were operated by DFS before, but was won in a competition by Austrocontrol from Austria. Later, the Spanish airports, or 12 of them, was also put out for competition, and previously they were operated by Enere as an ANSP there. But in this competition, Ferronats won 9 of the airports, and Serco won 3 airports. This is interesting because this was completely new actors in the ANSP market. Ferronats is a joint venture between a Spanish entrepreneur called Ferrovial and NATS, which is the UK ANSP. To a completely new company, and also Serco was a new company, completely Spanish, set up to participate in this competition. Same thing has happened in Sweden between 2010 until this year. There's 16 airports, small regional airports that were previously operated by LFV, the Swedish government-owned ANSP, was put out for competition, and the private company ACR, which was set up for this reason, they won all of them airports in Sweden. To move on, so far, most of the airports has been regional ones, or small, medium size. The really first big one that was put out to competition was Gatwick in the UK. A large airport in London, the second biggest after Heathrow. And there was a competition in 2016. The DFS in Germany, who now has decided they would also compete internationally, they won the service for Gatwick and established a company in UK called Air Navigation Services, ANS. And 2 years later, they also won the Edinburgh airport, which was put out to competition there. In Norway, where we operate, has been 2 competitions. There's one listed in the table, but there was one before this in 2016, which was a private airport called Sandefjord Airport. There, both the ATC service and also the CNS service was put out for competition, and we were lucky enough at Avinor. We won that competition, but last year there was 2 more airports put out for competition, but this time only the air traffic control services, and this time Serco from Spain, who is also moving outside of Spain, who won this. So now we operate all airports in Norway except these 2, the smaller airports that Serco is operating. So this is the status as we are today. So we have had some time to learn a few things from this, which I wanted to show in next slide. In general, you could say that the main goal has been achieved. The governments or the airport owners who has been driving this, they have seen a cost savings between 20 to 50% for the ANS services they buy. Most cases have been between 30 and 40%, but there has been all the way up to 50% lower cost to pay to the ANSP. At the same time, we have not seen any issues with the quality or the safety levels have suffered from this competition. So there were some concerns from many actors beforehand, but this has not materialized. We're also seeing in Europe a cultural change in many of the ANSP, also in countries which are not being privatized yet. They see that if they don't change themselves, somebody else will take over the business. So it has helped increase for the ANSP to be more customer-centric, and also have sped up the introduction of new technology to optimize and to improve and also make the service cheaper. So it's a positive momentum in Europe around this at the moment. As I mentioned, most of the competitions has been on the air traffic control side. But if we look at the next slide, there is, next slide please. Thank you. There is also a case for a deregulation of the CNS services, but it's a bit more tricky. Privatization of a tower you can do one by one because the cost effectiveness is okay if you do it for one tower or many towers. But for CNS, which is a more integrated service between shared by many airports and also the ACCs, you have to, if you want to have a competition on those, you have to put them out at least in a cluster or region because there is so many shared costs and system between them. So you can't, as an ANSP, it doesn't make sense to bid for just one airport for CNS. We also see a development now that CNS can be provided on a transnational level, as many of the services that we traditionally have on the ground, communication, navigation, and radar and so on, can now be handled by satellite-based system. We have ADSB already a global service provider for ADSB called Arion, who operates a big network of small satellites, who provides a ADSB service and can also provide a communication service. And of course, we also have satellite-based navigation using the GPS satellites, for instance. So what we probably will see here is a hybrid between some ground-based and some satellite-based services. But clearly, there is a development in a more global CNS providers, we believe. Next slide. The main target, or main objectives, as I said, has been achieved in Europe with the cost level going down a lot. But of course, there has been some problems as well, and not everybody in Europe and not all players have been positive to this, if you like. We have seen in some countries there's actually been court actions by the old NSP to try to stop the competition from happening, and also complaints about the procurement process that have led to a new NSP coming in. There's also been some problems with when a new NSP comes in, there hasn't been enough ATCOs available to continue to run the service. And I will talk a little bit more about that later. In many countries in Europe, we also have it's a civil NSP that also operates the NSP for the military. And in some countries, we have seen that the military has objected to or even stopped the competition because they do not want foreign NSP handling their traffic. So there has been some competition that has been stopped and even reversed by the national militaries. Also on the CAA side, there has been not any objections about competition, but there has been a new way for them to work, because traditionally they have only had to work with one ANSP in their country. Now all of a sudden they have 2 or 3 or 4 ANSP to work with and certify and check on in each country. So the workload on the CAAs has become, if not much bigger, but bigger and different, since they now have to work with or towards many ANSP at the same time, while they had one before. And last, there has been, of course, some protests from the labor unions because they see this as a bit frightening. They fear loss of jobs, especially from the air traffic controllers. So it has taken some time to move them along, to accept that they sometimes have to change their employee as a new NSP has won their tower, if you want. The next slide, I shall not go through it in detail as I see the time is running, but you typically see 3 phases in a country or a region when you introduce competition. It's the same for other industries like telecom and so on. And the first phase, which Europe has been for now for the last 10 decades, there is a lot of new companies coming in, all fighting for contracts, a lot of pressure on price, but also a standardization of how the service is delivered. Eventually, we will move into what we call a consolidation phase. We have seen that especially in telecom in Europe. Companies start merging, new alliances pop up, and some providers, they go bankrupt because there has been such a hard pressure on price here. And eventually, we will move into a more mature market in phase 3, where we will see fewer but bigger providers who are now working not only national but internationally, together with a few niche players, like for instance Arion being a satellite-based only operator. Then again, the profitability will be better and a sort of more predictable market. But phase 3 in the mature market, though, is still a bit off as we see it. Most of the countries are not even in the phase 1 yet in Europe. Those who are there, they are somewhere in between phase 1 and phase 2. So it's interesting to see when the market will become more mature, if you like. So, next slide. I want to end with a few lessons that we and others in Europe have learned so far. How to do this properly, if you want, and with success. First, it's very important to run this in a very professional and transparent procurement process. Otherwise, you will have delays, maybe court actions and so on. It's very important that all the competitors that are invited to participate have this access to the same information. In some countries, the old NSP has had an advantage having all the information, and that has not been shared with the new competitors. That will make it very difficult for new entrants into the market. Also, after the second bullet, after the contract has been won by a new NSP, it's very important to give them enough time to do the transition in a structured, safe manner. Anything less than 6 months, 9 months is very difficult for a new operator to take over the service and to get certified in a new country and so on. And in those countries where the transition has been very successful, we have typically seen a transition board being set up shared by the owner of the airport, where the new and the old NSP and the CAA participate, meet regular, and discuss any issues or disagreement that shows up. It's much easier solved when it's guided by the owner of the airport. Also, as I mentioned before, in some cases there hasn't been enough air traffic controllers available after transition. They might have chosen to stay with the old NSP or quit altogether because they do not want to join the new company coming in. So here it's very important that the airport owner and the CAA makes it easy for the new provider to be able to either take over all the existing air traffic controllers, or at least ensure that the old NSP has to provide release air traffic controllers to the new providers until they have trained enough people. Otherwise, you get service disruptions and regulations after transition, which is not what anybody wants here. Also, involve the defense force or the military early if the airport is also having military traffic there, to make sure that the defense forces are happy with a new and comfortable with a new operator. Last, in Europe, traditionally, the airport owner has also been the same company or the same organization as the ANSP. The most transparent processes are when they are not in the same organization, or at least not governed by the same management, because there will always be complaints by the other ANSPs that this is not a fair competition, and if the ANSP is owned by the airport owner, they might also have access to more information than the rest of the competitors, which will make for a difficult procurement process, as I mentioned in the first bullet point here. So, looking at my clock, I see I have to stop here to allow for my colleague to talk about remote towers. So, thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions after the remote tower presentations.
Thank you very, very much. That was very interesting, a very good introduction to the liberalization of the sector. So we move on now to Mr. Henriksen, who's going to be talking to us about the provision of tower services from remote locations. Please, Tion-Won, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to this group of people. Buenos dias a todos. Like Håkan, I have to apologize that I would not be able to have this presentation in Spanish, but we'll do our best in English. And as Håkan said, the presentation will also be delivered with or is already delivered with the Spanish translation. So. I will talk about remote towers and try to highlight what benefits there could be there for the airport customer. I will start with a little bit of comparing big airports and small airports seen from the ANSP perspective mainly. You have other challenges than these I will touch upon. And then I will discuss a little about in what instances could remote tower technology be a good change or a good way to achieve benefits. And then I'll move on to talk a little bit about what we have done in the remote tower program in Norway and why we did it. And then have a little list of conclusions at the end. If we start to look at the larger hub airport and the challenges that these types of airports face as we experience it from the air navigation service provider point of view, we often face quite complex operations with multiple runways, complex airport layout. There is a multitude of systems and infrastructure for ATM, often advanced SNGCS systems, complex communication systems. And when there is a need for airport expansion and a need to ensure the future capacity, we introduce some construction work and change the airport layout, or we need to resurface runways and so on. And then we face, in fact, quite complex projects to deliver this for the future capacity, but also to deliver this in a way that doesn't limit capacity during that project phase. And generally, there are high investments needed to deliver the air traffic management infrastructure, which also includes in some cases, some quite high-rise tower buildings like the one we see on the picture, which is from Oslo Airport. And another thing which is also becoming more common is that these types of airports, which are big hubs and air traffic machines, they need to have some contingency arrangements for business continuity if there is some type of catastrophic failure in the original control tower. Next slide, please. If we go to the local or small regional airport, the challenges might be very different. In fact, still seen from the ANSP point of view, I have to underline. The traffic density is generally low. And seen from an ANSP point of view, we rather deliver opening hours than capacity. Capacity is generally not a problem, but the opening hours can be a challenge to meet, perhaps with some traffic during an early morning, some midday, and then some traffic perhaps late at night. And that type of requirements for opening hours often drives the need for staffing. Rostering becomes more difficult in such situation. The ATM infrastructure is very often quite basic. You have your comm, you have your navigation equipment, and also access to the airport systems, of course. But generally, things like surface movement guidance and control is missing, and it's a quite basic technological solution to deliver the service. There's a low number of movements per ATCO shift, and that of course has a negative result on the air traffic controller productivity. You deliver some service to a couple of movements, and then you perhaps are sitting without too much to do for the next couple of hours before the next movement moves in. So it's to get a high level of productivity at those types of airport, that's quite a challenge. And in fact, in some cases, there are airports with no air traffic service at all. And those airports might wish to have that service in some way, but it's too costly to establish it. Then we move on to the next slide, please. I think this is the interesting question, and might be provocative, but I think it's a good question to answer or to discuss right now. Should we build another control tower? The airport might have a runway expansion plan, and now we're talking about the big ones. We have a parallel runway airport. We plan to introduce a third one, and then we might need another tower. But actually, the remote tower technology makes it possible to do such runway expansions and service that new runway with the remote tower technology rather than building another tower. Constructions at the airport, for instance, a new terminal might create new blind spots that weren't there before. And the choice is either to rebuild or build a new control tower to solve the problem. But also in this case, a remote tower technology could be a solution. Of course, building a high-rise control tower at the large airport, that's in itself a very big investment. And perhaps is a digital control room with new system in it a better solution for the airport rather than building a 90-meter high control tower, which will amount to quite a high investment sum. Another driver for remote tower technology might be the need to implement a completely new ATM system at the airport. I've talked to air navigation service providers and airports where they have actually considered we need a new ATM system. What we'll do is that we introduce the remote tower technology. We move the operations from the current tower to the digital control room, and we wish to keep the regular tower after the transition, so we introduce the new ATM system in the old tower and rebuild it as required, and then move back there. And suddenly you also have a contingency facility at your airport, which can also be used for training. So that's a different way to approach the issue. And of course, if you already have an ATM contingency facility at the airport, you need to improve it by adding a visual component or even renewing it as it might be an old one. So these are the possibilities that this technology or these challenges that this technology can solve. Next slide, please. if we look at this small local airport in Norway, where we actually received the first pictures just before the weekend. Well, this is a very small facility, but when we need to replace it, it is still an investment. And of course, like Avinor owning a lot of airport, this will amount to quite a budget if you need to invest in a lot of these facilities. And then you need to think, how often do we use it and for how long? We have the question of productivity. Typically for these types of airports in Norway, we will have somewhere between 4 and let's say 10 to 15 movements per regular day. So it goes without saying that the productivity among the staff in the tower will be fairly low and a lot of time spent without having too much to do. Another issue or another opportunity is that we can improve the quality of service. We can deliver the service when actually needed. When it's not needed, we can have the airport in a sort of closed or semi-closed mode, but it can still be opened in quite a short notice, or we can provide service for critical types of operations, such as search and rescue and ambulance flights. And finally, one opportunity here is that we can improve the quality of service by achieving standardization across a network of airports. And when we had our discussions with our major airline customer on this local airport network, that was one of their important inputs, that we can avoid these local differences that very often develop across the network of airport, despite being operated by the same organization. Next slide, please. The alternative. Well, first of all, this is an artist impression of the main remote tower center as being built now in Bodø in Norway. It is actually now more than an artist impression or an architect impression. It's under installation, but the layout of the control room is approximately what you can see here. By doing this as a centralized operation, we can improve the ATCO productivity, because you can move from one airport to another during the shift, and you can use parts of the shift to do like refreshment training. Of course, you can have multiple airport endorsements so that you are able to provide services to more than one airport. You can move from one airport to a second and maybe to a third one during your shift. A very important driver in our program is that we plan to deliver multiple airport services or services to multiple airports by using just one controller, which means that we can increase the productivity quite tremendously for the staff working in the remote tower center compared to a single operation airport, single operation service provision. We introduce new tools for controllers like infrared cameras, very powerful zoom cameras that goes beyond the performance of any binoculars that you have been used to, and also movement detection and hotspot detection and so on. So there are a lot of possibilities with the technology that can improve the situational awareness for the controller and also improve the quality and safety of the service. Another important factor is that by doing this, we can improve people's job satisfaction. Sitting in a small control tower with quite some time without any movements at all, and very rarely you have a lot of traffic, it can be seen as somewhat boring. And to operate in a center together with a lot of other colleagues and have a more traffic and lots of things to do during the shift can be more satisfactory than having just those few movements per day. A service delivery when needed is important, and I think we can see that in a couple of ways. In Norway, it's very important that the airport is available when needed for critical operations, like the nighttime ambulance picking up a sick person and flying he or she to the hospital. But also, we might see possibilities for new business models here, where an airport with a very limited traffic level might need to or think that, okay, I need service for 2 hours in the morning, and I need service for 2 hours in the afternoon. And a possibility here is, for instance, that the service is sold to the airport as a service, but the investment made and all the installation needed, that's financed by the air navigation service provider upfront, and they charge the airport for the actual services that they buy. So that's a different way to think than we have done traditionally. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about the Norwegian remote tower program. We are now operating one airport remotely, and we are planning to introduce 3 more during this year. We are now operating from a control room which is located in the airport terminal building at Bodø Airport, and we will move that operations to the main remote tower center, which you can see on this picture, and that's planned for mid-2021. And as Håkan also mentioned, that we will, by the end of the program, have 15 airports in operation in total. Most of these are small, local, and some regional airports. The important drivers in our program to achieve a good business case was one is the reduced capital expenditure by reducing the need for investment in new tower buildings. Many of our airports were built and set up in the 1960s, 1970s, and the building infrastructure is becoming old, and it needs either refurbishment or very often completely new buildings, which is costly and far more costly than setting up the remote tower camera mast. Another important factor is, of course, the efficient rostering that we can do with the staff. We reduce the operational expenditure by doing that, and that also involves the multiple airport service provision and multiple airport endorsement for the staff working in the center. And the quality of service, as mentioned, like standardization, and also ensuring that the airlines have and the airports have open airports and access to airports when it's required. And then one more slide, I think. A summary. Airports face different challenges, but air navigation service requires both infrastructure and qualified staff. Remote tower technology in general, I think, can enable cost reductions. If you look at different airports, big, small, opening hours, traffic patterns, all that, the solutions may differ from airport to airport. And also, I think that technology is evolving. Håkan touched upon things like space-based ADS-B, and by introducing more surveillance capability, perhaps at an acceptable cost to smaller airport, we can see different technological solutions in the future. So I think we're at the start of the remote tower technology or the digital tower technology and the use of it. I think we will see more future opportunities for improvement in the years to come. And with that, I say thank you very much for your attention, and I leave it to Rafael to continue.
Okay, well, thank you very much. A very interesting presentation, Torbjørn. Very a lot of information to chew, and a lot of ideas, I presume, for many of our colleagues in Latin America to think about. I'll pass it on now to my colleague Francisco. I actually will have to leave in a few moments, so Francisco will take over with all the questions. Francisco, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I have a question for from Curtis Peters from the Civil Aviation Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, asking on how costly is to establish a remote tower operation.
Well, that certainly depends on the needs that you have in terms of how advanced your camera system will need to be. For instance, you can consider, would I need an infrared camera? How important is the visual resolution of the camera system? So it's very difficult to give a straightforward answer. But if in our program, when we have compared the cost of setting up a new control tower with the cost of setting up the infrastructure needed for the remote tower technology, and we have put in there things like infrared and also all the functionality that we have in the airport from before. I think we have, or our estimate is that the investment is around 40% less for the remote tower technology compared to a new one, new regular tower.
Thank you. And also Curtis just sent an additional question asking, well, I acknowledge that the cameras of the remote tower are high resolution, as you mentioned, but how is the legality in terms of incidents and accidents to deal with?
Well, if I understand that, question right, it's about how the question is, if I get it right, it's actually how good does a camera system need to be? And
yeah,
if we look at,
and in terms of the legality in case of an incident or accident occurs.
Yeah, I think the question to the last part of it is, or the answer to the last part of it is, must be the regulatory requirements steering the remote tower implementation. And this has been going on, work on this regulatory framework has been going on in the ASA for quite some time. And they have some methods and also acceptable means of compliance in establishing a remote tower system with a sufficient visual quality to be accepted by the regulator. Still, when using that framework, the answer to what type of technology and things like resolution, frame rate, and so on may differ from airport to airport. But there is a regulatory process governing this implementation, of course.
Okay, let me check if we have another question. Well, we haven't received more questions, but in case we receive more questions, we will forward it to you both for you to answer that. I don't know, Rafael, you want to say some few words before closing the session? As I mentioned, we will forward the question as soon as we receive those to our both panelists and yeah, and I think on my side is...
Thank you very much, Francisco. Thank you very much, Håkan, Tjonborn. I'm going to say a few words in Spanish to our audience. So, as Francisco was saying, tal como decía Francisco, cualquier pregunta que tengan, por favor, no duden en enviárnosla a nosotros. Francisco, si puedes enseñar la dirección para las preguntas y con mucho gusto se las pasaremos a los presentadores. I'll say it in English now for those who don't speak Spanish. Thank you very much. And we actually had 60 participants on this talk. That's actually very good. And those of you, please, who have any questions afterwards, do not please hesitate to send them to us, to this email address that you can see on the screen, and we will pass them on to our speakers. Once again, Håkan, Tjomborn, thank you very much. Very interesting topic, and surely we will follow this up in the next presentations and events, as I was saying to you. Thank you very much y muchas gracias a todos por participar. Francisco.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Thank you for the panelists for the time to prepare the presentations. Thank you. Have a nice day.